There is a version of this story where a poor boy becomes the richest man alive. That part is not the mystery. The mystery is this. The US government spent years trying to tear his empire apart. They won. The court ordered it broken into pieces, and somehow within 2 years he was richer than before. To understand how that happens, the story goes back to a cold morning in 1855 to a boy who owned nothing but a ledger. He is 16 in Cleveland, Ohio, September 26, 1855. John D. Rockefeller walks into the office of Hewitt and Turtle, a small commission firm that ships grain, produce, and hay along the lake. He is not hired to think, he is hired to count. Every barrel, every dollar, every debt, written down, checked twice. He will remember this date for the rest of his life. He will call it his day job, not his birthday, this one. For 2 years he climbs from clerk to bookkeeper to something close to indispensable, earning around $50 a month, saving almost all of it. He keeps a personal ledger of his own life the same way he keeps the company's income, tithes, savings, down to the cent. In 1859, at 19, he leaves. He starts his own firm, Clark and Rockefeller. With $1,000 he saved and 1,000 more borrowed from his father. Produce, grain, salt, meat shipped across the Great Lakes. That same year, 400 miles east in the Titusville, Pennsylvania, a man named Edwin Drake strikes oil. The whole country catches fire with the idea of it. He does not yet. He keeps counting. After a few moments in the future, he finally begins to take actions that eventually give him control. By 1863, the American oil business was less an industry than a stampede. Men were pouring into northwestern Pennsylvania, drilling wells on hunches, striking it rich or striking nothing at all. Rockefeller watched the frenzy from a distance and drew a conclusion almost no one else was drawing. The money wasn't in finding oil. It was in what happened to the oil after it came out of the ground. He was 24, with his produce business partner Maurice Clark and a chemist named Samuel Andrew. He put money in a small refinery on the Cuyahoga River flats in Cleveland. Andrews, Clark and Company, capable of producing about 30 barrels a day. Cleveland made sense for the same reason a river makes sense for a mill. The Atlantic and Great Western Railroad ran straight through it, connecting the oil field to the eastern market. He kept his produce commission business running alongside it, hedging nothing, betting on refining as the stable half of a violent industry. Drilling was a coin flip. Refining was a business he could actually manage. The arrangement lasted less than 2 years before it cracked. In February 1865, Rockefeller and Clark's brothers clashed over how the company should be run. Rather than compromise, Rockefeller forced the issue to auction. The entire operation sold to the highest bidder among the partners themselves. He won it at $72,500, a number he would later call the foundation of everything that followed. He renamed the company Rockefeller and Andrews. Within 3 years, it was the largest refinery on earth. He didn't stop at refining. He bought the corporates that made his barrel. He bought into transport. He built out his own marketing arm. Every piece of the chain that touched this product, he wanted to own outright, so that no supplier or middleman could ever hold leverage over him the way unreliable partner once had. In 1866, his brother William joined the business. In 1867, Henry Flagler came in as a partner, a relationship that would become the second most important one in the company's history, after Rockefeller's own. By 1868, the firm operated the largest oil refineries in the world and was turning out roughly 1,500 barrels of kerosene a day. Around 1869, Rockefeller began describing something he simply called the plan. Not a slogan, not a public statement, a private conviction repeated to his closest partner that the oil business was drawing in what he called ruinous competition. Too many refiners, too much capacity, prices collapsing every time the market so much as blink. Pools and gentlemen's agreement between competitors had already been tried and had already failed. Men would shake hands one week and undercut each other the next. Rockefeller's conclusion was blunter than a handshake. If competition could be trusted to regulate itself, it would have to be replaced with one organization large enough that regulation wasn't necessary. On January 10, 1870, that conviction took a legal form. The partnership, reorganized as the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, capitalized at $1 million, with Rockefeller holding roughly a quarter to a third of it alongside his brother and partners. The name itself was a strategy. In an industry where kerosene quality varied widely from refiner to refiner, some of it clean enough to burn safely, some of it liable to explode in a customer's lamp. Standard was a promise of uniformity. Customer didn't have to gamble on which refiner they trusted. There was only one standard, and it was his. By 1871, the machine was already running off efficiency most competitors would match. Rockefeller controlled his own steel cutting and kiln drying operation for barrel production, which meant the barrels that once cost around $2.50 a piece began costing me a fraction of it. He owned tank cars that cut down on spoilage and damage during shipping. With those advantages alone, Standard Oil of Ohio refining roughly a tenth of the nation's kerosene, already the single largest operation in the country. Though still far from dominant, Rockefeller later described the thinking behind it plainly, that expanding the Ohio Company and bringing rival refining interests directly into partnership with it would protect the industry as a whole, rather than leave it to keep cannibalizing itself. Then came the 6 weeks that history would remember longest. Cleveland in early 1872 was the undisputed capital of American refining, but it was also chaos. Roughly 26 independent refiners crowded into one city, undercutting each other into the ground. Late in 1871, a group including Rockefeller and Flagler had quietly negotiated an alliance with several railroads, a circuit arrangement known as the South Improvement Company. On paper, it was extraordinary. Participating refiners would receive rebates as steep as $1.06 a barrel on shipments from Cleveland to New York, and something even more aggressive than a rebate, a drawback, meaning the railroads would pay Standard Oil a cut of what they charge Standard's competitors. Every time a competitor shipped a barrel, the railroad would also hand over their competitors' shipping records. Word leaked before a single rebate was ever paid out. Pennsylvania's legislature revoked the company's charter that April, and South Improvement Company died without ever being activated. But by then, the damage or the advantage, depending on which side of the table a person sat on, was already done. The threat alone had done the work. Between February 17 and March 28, 1872, Rockefeller bought 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries. Some deal closed within 48 hours of the first conversation. 6 plants changed hands in a single 2-day stretch. Local banks, aware of which way the wind was blowing, grew reluctant to extend credit to anyone competing against him. To the man selling out, Rockefeller offered a version of the same pitch each time, calm and almost paternal in tone.
We will take your Birdwits. We will give you Standard Oil stock. Take it, and your family will never know.
Some accepted out of relief, others accepted out of fear that refusing would leave them with nothing at all once the larger company simply outlasted them. One of the larger acquisitions, Clark, Payne and Company, sold for $400,000 plus stock. In 6 weeks, Standard's refining capacity jumped from around 1,500 barrels a day to more than 10,000. History would came to call this the Cleveland Massacre. Rockefeller, looking back on it later, called it something closer to a beginning.
It was really the first great step on the march to industrial supremacy.
Cleveland was never the final destination, it was the template. Once the model had proven itself, Rockefeller carried outward, city by city, always going after the largest player in the market first. On the theory that once the biggest fish was landed, the smaller ones would follow without much of a fight. Charles Pratt's refining operation in New York came into the fold. Atlantic Refining in Philadelphia came into the fold. In Pittsburgh, John Arbor's operation came into the fold. Arbor would go on to become one of the Rockefeller's most trusted lieutenants. Between 1873 and 1879, this pattern repeated itself across nearly every major refining center in the country. By 1879, the numbers told their own story. Somewhere between 19 and 95% of all the oil refined in United States moved through a facility Rockefeller controlled. And control by this point meant more than refineries. It meant the pipelines that moved crude to his plants. It meant the tank cars and storage facilities. It meant barrel factories running at a cost no independent competitors could touch. It meant marketing network that reached directly into cities and towns across the country. Waste products that other refiners simply discarded, like gasoline, a near worthless byproduct at the time, were being captured and sold. Railroad rebates, negotiated now through sheer shipping volume rather than secret alliances, keep his transportation costs below what anyone else could negotiate. The blunt instrument of the South Improvement Company was gone, but the advantage it had proven was never abandoned, only refined into something quieter and harder to challenge in court. The final act came on January 2nd in 1882. More than 40 separate companies, refineries, pipelines, marketing arms scattered across a dozen states with a dozen different sets of local ownership laws were folded into a single legal structure, the Standard Oil Trust. A small group of trustees, Rockefeller foremost among them, held certificates representing the whole, while a central office in New York coordinated operations behind a wall of legal complexity so dense that outsiders could see the trust effects everywhere and still never quite prove how the machine actually worked. Rockefeller himself asked years later to account for how it had all come together, describe it less as conquest and more as sequence. Gather the information, build the nucleus, merge with the largest competitors first, eliminate the excess capacity driving prices down, integrate every price of the chain, and let control follow naturally from cooperation and efficiency rather than force. It was a tidy explanation for a process that left, in barely a decade, one man holding what amounted to the oil supply of an entire nation. To understand why a man built a fortress this careful, this story goes back further than 1855, back to a house that was never in one place for long. John D. Rockefeller was born July 8, 1839 in Richford, New York. His father, William, was a man people called Big Bill, a traveling salesman of cures that did not cure anything, a gambler, occasionally a bigamist, gone for months at a time, and unpredictable when he returned. His mother, Eliza, was the opposite of him in every way, a devout Baptist who ran the household on discipline, scripture, and thrift because she had no other choice. Between them, they gave him two education at once. From his father, he learned how to negotiate, how to read a room, how not to trust it, while from his mother, how to save, how to give, and how to believe that both of those things were sacred. As a boy, he raised turkeys to sell. He sold candy door to door. He lent small sums to neighbors at interest, tracked carefully from the time he could hold a pencil. By the time he reached habit and total, at 16, he was not learning to be careful with money. He already was. This is the part most people skip. The empire did not start with oil. It started with a boy deciding very early that he would never again be at the mercy of someone's unreliable. The trouble started building almost as soon as the trust did. In 1881, a journalist named Henry Demarius Floyd published a piece in the Atlantic Monthly called "The Story of a Great Monopoly," the first major press attack on Standard Oil, describing men like Rockefeller as gluttony of luxury and power, who believed the public needed to be kept in line through fear. It was an early warning shot. State prosecutors were already circling in the mid-1880s, and Ohio, Rockefeller's home state, filled with the first serious legal challenge. In 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled the trust illegal and ordered it dissolved. Rockefeller complied on paper and almost nowhere else. The trust holdings were nominally reorganized into 20 separate companies, each with its own name and its own paperwork. But they kept operating in concert, coordinated from the same central office as before. 1899, the fiction was formalized rather than fixed. Standard Oil of New Jersey was reconstructed as a holding company that simply owned the stock of the other 19, achieving legally what the old trust had achieved informally. Between 1880 and 1911, some 33 separate lawsuits would be filed against the company across various states. Most fees, a few landed hard enough to leave marks. Then, in 1890, the Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, sponsored in one of history's small ironies by Senator John Sherman of Ohio, Rockefeller's own state. The law was sweeping in its language and almost toothless in its early application. Courts spent the 1890s more inclined to use it against labor strike than against industrial monopolies. For a while, it looked like exactly the kind of legislation Rockefeller could outlast without much trouble. What he could not outlast was a journalist with a personal grievance and a national magazine behind her. Ida Tarbell's father had been one of the small Pennsylvania oil producers driven out of business decades earlier, and her brother worked for one of Standard Oil's remaining rivals, Pure Oil, feeding her documents and contacts along the way. Beginning in November 1902, McClure's magazine ran her investigation in serialized form for nearly 2 years. Later collected into two-volume history of the Standard Oil Company in 1904. She called the company an octopus, its arms reaching into every part of American commerce, and laid out in granular, damning detail the rebates, the secret alliances, the deliberate crushing of competitors. It reshaped public opinion almost overnight and handed federal prosecutors the roadmap they'd been missing. Rockefeller, by this point, had mostly stepped back from running the company day to day. He had handed the operational reins to John Arbon back in 1896 and spent much of his time on golf course, a game he would taken up on his doctor's orders and increasingly on giving money away. This was not new behavior so much as an old habit finally given room to scale. He had titled as a teenager on a bookkeeper's salary of $15 a month, tracking every donation in the same ledgers where he tracked his savings. What changed, once the fortune became large enough to require it, was the method. In 1891, he brought a Baptist minister named Frederick D. Gates as his personal philanthropic advisor, and Gates pushed him away from scattershot charity, hand out to whoever asked, towards something closer to how he would build Standard Oil itself. Identity in the underlying problem, funded systematically, and treat generosity as an engineering project rather than a reflex. The results arrived one institution at a time. In 1890, an initial gift of $600,000 helped found the University of Chicago, the first of what would eventually total tens of millions of dollars in support. In 1901, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research opened in New York, an institution built specifically to fund scientific research with no obligation to turn a profit, unheard of at the time. In 1902, The General Education Board was chartered to expand schooling across the American South, black and white alike, at a scale no private citizen had previously attempted. In 1909, the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission launched a campaign to eradicate hookworm disease across the southern states, treating it as a public health crisis rather than a private misfortune. And in 1913, all of it was folded into a single permanent institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, chartered with a mission stated as plainly as anything he would ever put his name to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Historians still argue over how to read the timing of it. The giving accelerated precisely as the lawsuit piled up and Tarbell's articles turned his name into a national villain. Whether that makes it conscience or armor is not a question anyone has ever definitely settled, including most likely Rockefeller himself. Both readings fit the same set of facts. Then, the federal government finally moved in 1906, when the Department of Justice filed suit against Standard Oil of New Jersey directly, leaning heavily on the trial Tarbell had already laid out and on testimony gathered by the U.S. Industrial Commission. The following year, a federal judge in Chicago named Kennesaw Mountain Landis, later famous as baseball's first commissioner, handed down a fine against Standard Oil of Indiana so large it made front page across the country, $29,240,000 for accepting illegal freight rebates from a single railroad. It was overturned on appeal within a year, but the number itself did its work. It told the public and Rockefeller's own board exactly how much appetite the government now had for these fights. The case ground through the courts for more years, argued before the Supreme Court in March 1910, re-argued that January, and decided on May 15, 1911. The ruling was unanimous. Standard Oil, the court found, had unreasonably restrained trade under the Sherman Act, a phrase that would itself become a permanent fixture of American law, known ever as the rule of reason. The remedy was total dissolution within 6 months into 34 separate operation companies, each required to compete against the others as though they never shared a boardroom. By then, Rockefeller had been away from daily operation for 15 years. He wrote about the ruling the way most of the country did, from a distance. Already retired, already mostly known for hospitals and universities rather than rebates and pipelines. Artpool was the one who would spend the previous decade in courtrooms defending the empire. Rockefeller's role in 1911 was simpler and stranger. He was above almost everyone else, the person with the most to lose from the verdict and the least visible reaction to it. The mechanics of the breakup determined everything that followed. Standard Oil had operated as a trust, meaning shareholders didn't own pieces of any single company. They held certificates representing a portion stake in the whole combined enterprise. Rockefeller's certificates represent roughly a quarter of that whole. When the trust split into its 34 pieces, the law didn't ask him to choose which ones to keep. He simply received the same 25% slice of every single piece. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which would one day become Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, which would become Mobil, Standard Oil of California, which would become Chevron, Standard Oil of Indiana, which would become Amoco, Continental Oil, which would become Conoco, and roughly 30 others besides. He didn't sell a single certificate through the entire process. What happened next is the part that still gets studied in economic classrooms. As one trust, Standard Oil had spent a decade value under a permanent cloud. Investors pressing in the risk of exactly the kind of federal action that had just occurred. Once broken apart, each of the 34 companies could be judged purely on its own regional strength, its own management, its own numbers, free of that cloud and free of each other. Investors liked what they found. Share by share, the combined value of the pieces started climbing past what the whole trust had ever been worth intact. The market effectively announced that Standard Oil had been worth more broken than assembled. a verdict the government's own lawyers had not remotely intended to deliver. The gains didn't arrive as a single spike on the day of the ruling. One academic study of the period found no unusual jump in the stock prices of the announcement itself. Since investors had already priced in years of expecting exactly this outcome, the real transformation happened quietly over the 2 years that followed, as the newly independent companies proved themselves as one earnings report at a time. By 1913, estimates of Rockefeller's personal fortune had climbed toward the neighborhood of $900 million. Other analysis, measured across the full decade rather than just the first 2 years, put the growth at 3 to 5 times his pre-breakup wealth. By the middle of the 1910s, multiple historians place him as the first person in American history to be worth $1 billion. A title that, depending on which estimate is used, arrived either despite the government's verdict or more precisely because of it. The government had spent 5 years and one Supreme Court ruling trying to take the crown off his head. What they actually did was cut it into 34 smaller crowns, hand him a quarter of each one, and watch the total grew heavier than the original had ever been.